Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I'll analyze the case of Bryan Steven Lawson. First I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Bryan Steven Lawson was born on July 5, 1983, and lived in Hawkins County, Tennessee. Sometime around 2007, he became romantically involved with a woman named Beth Lawson. She went by the name Chandra. She had been born on November 18, 1976, and had a son named Liam from a prior relationship. Chandra had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She was in the Tennessee Army National Guard until 2012, but sustained a neck injury and became addicted to substances. In May 2014, Chandra had a son named Braden. Bryan believed that Braden was his son, but he was not. It sounds like Chandra had engaged in some extracurricular activity. Bryan, Chandra, Liam, and Braden lived in an apartment on Holliston Mills Road in Churchill, Tennessee. Churchill is 9 miles west of Kingsport, near the border between Tennessee and Virginia. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On January 27, 2017, at about 7:45 a.m., Bryan called 911 and indicated that he shot his wife. Bryan said, "I need an ambulance. My wife's dying. I shot her with a pistol. She was beating on me this morning. I've got it on videotape. I didn't want to kill her. I was afraid she was going to hurt me. She had a baseball bat. She was trying to hit me with it." Later in the conversation, Bryan told the operator, "I can't take it no more, sir. I can't take it no more." Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. Chandra Lawson was dead in the apartment. She had been shot with a Taurus Judge revolver chambered in .45 Colt. At the time of the shooting, there were only 3 people in the apartment: 33-year-old Bryan, 40-year-old Chandra, and 2-year-old Braden. 17-year-old Liam had already left for school when the shooting occurred. Inside the apartment, Bryan and Chandra had multiple security cameras, which had been installed 1.5 years earlier due to concerns about burglary. There were 2 cameras of interest to the investigation, one in the living room and one in the bedroom. About 45 minutes before the shooting, Bryan and Chandra could be seen in the living room. The cameras did not record audio, but it seemed clear the couple was arguing. Bryan was seated in a recliner as Chandra stood in front of him and appeared to be yelling. All of a sudden, Chandra started striking Bryan with her right hand. She repeatedly struck him as he put his hands up to block the attack. Chandra stopped the attack, appeared to yell at Bryan again, only to resume attacking. After this, Chandra reached behind the couch and retrieved a baseball bat. She appeared to threaten Bryan with the bat before striking the side of the recliner he was sitting in. Bryan wrestled with Chandra for control of the bat, but Chandra retained control. Using the bat, Chandra struck the floor 1 time near Bryan's left foot. Bryan had a congenital foot deformity in his left foot called clubfoot, which left him in pain. After yelling at Bryan, Chandra repeatedly struck the floor in the same spot. During this part of the confrontation, the video converted from black and white to color. Chandra put the baseball bat away after this, but she continued yelling at Bryan. About 10 minutes later, Chandra once again yelled at Bryan as he sat in the recliner. She was now wearing different clothing. Chandra kicked Bryan with her right foot. Later, she struck him with her right hand as she approached him from behind. After this attack, Chandra left the living room. Bryan walked outside the apartment, but then returned to the living room. Chandra came back into the living room with Braden. As she was helping Braden get dressed, Bryan could be seen retrieving a Taurus Judge revolver from behind the couch and putting it in the right pocket of his sweatshirt. Chandra did not see this. Bryan returned to the recliner and sat down. Chandra could be seen standing to Bryan's left with her son Braden next to her. She had a purse over her left shoulder as if she was preparing to leave the apartment. Once again, Chandra appeared to be yelling at Bryan. Using her right hand, she struck Bryan in the head 2 times. Without removing the revolver from his sweatshirt pocket, Bryan pointed it at Chandra and fired 3 times. Chandra was struck in the stomach, backed up, and dropped to the floor. This is when Bryan called 911. Bryan was placed under arrest. He was indicted several months later in August 2017 for first-degree murder and reckless endangerment. The second charge was because Braden was standing next to Chandra when the shots were fired. On February 1, 2019, as part of a plea bargain, Bryan Lawson pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment. He was sentenced to 15 years for the voluntary manslaughter and 1 year for the reckless endangerment. The sentences are to be served concurrently. He would normally have been eligible for parole after serving 30% of his sentence. However, under the terms of his plea bargain, he was eligible after serving 20%. This meant he had to serve 3 years. At the time I'm making this video, it appears as though Bryan Lawson is out on parole. Now moving to my analysis. This case is extremely controversial. Many people believe that Bryan never should have been charged with any crime in connection to this shooting. He did plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment. However, he almost certainly felt pressured due to the threat of spending life in prison. Bryan said that he considered taking his case to trial. Clearly, he did not believe he was guilty of murder. This brings me to the question, was Bryan Lawson guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Bryan shot and killed Chandra in the living room of their apartment. At the time she was killed, Chandra was unarmed, and it looked like she was getting ready to leave. Chandra had attacked Bryan several times leading up to this, but Bryan could have escaped the apartment. For instance, he walked outside just before retrieving the revolver. Furthermore, Chandra's final attack involved her striking Bryan with her hand. In Tennessee, lethal force is only justified to prevent death or serious bodily injury. On the 911 call, Bryan said that Chandra had a baseball bat and was trying to hit him with it, but Chandra did not have a baseball bat at the time of the shooting. Bryan also indicated that he had captured the incident on video, which makes it seem like he only fired because he knew he had captured Chandra's attack, like he knew that the shooting would appear to be justified. One could interpret the evidence in this case as supporting the theory that Bryan planned to kill Chandra. This is where the first-degree murder charge comes into play. This theory would go something like this. Bryan knew that Chandra attacked him frequently, and he was tired of it. He could not do anything to stop her because he would be the one accused of a crime. On the morning of the shooting, Chandra repeatedly struck Bryan and threatened him with a baseball bat. Bryan had enough of being a punching bag. Instead of leaving the situation, he retrieved the revolver because he was intent on revenge. He knew that Chandra would attack him again, or maybe he did something to provoke her into attacking. Bryan knew how to antagonize Chandra. It really didn't seem that difficult, considering her extreme level of anger and aggression. When Chandra struck him again, Bryan shot and killed her. He immediately called 911 and mentioned the baseball bat and the video. Moving to the exculpatory factors, on the morning of the shooting, Chandra repeatedly attacked Bryan. He put his hands up to defend himself, but he did not strike her back. At one point, Chandra introduced a baseball bat into the equation. A bat can be considered a deadly weapon. Chandra had bipolar disorder. In her mental health records, a clinician indicated that when Chandra was manic, she mistreated her husband. Chandra frequently used illegal substances. On several occasions prior to her death, she was captured on the camera in the bedroom, injecting herself with drugs. Chandra did not use drugs on the day she was killed. This is consistent with the theory that she was miserable due to withdrawal symptoms, which only made her more angry and violent. Bryan said that prior to the shooting, Chandra had threatened to kill Braden. This meant that Bryan was not only trying to defend himself, but he was trying to protect Chandra's son. Right before Bryan fired the revolver, Chandra struck him 2 times with her right hand. Chandra was unpredictable. Maybe she was done with the attack, or maybe she was going to take it a step further. Who knows what she would have done next? Perhaps she would have killed him or inflicted serious bodily injury. Something else to consider here is the cumulative effect of Chandra's mistreatment of Bryan. She may not have engaged in a lethal attack right before she was killed, but her pattern of behavior caused Bryan to reach his limit. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Bryan Lawson was guilty of murder? No, I believe he was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Chandra Lawson was the aggressor. She understood that she was committing a crime by attacking Bryan. She was aware that he had the right to defend himself. Despite this, Chandra decided to take her chances. Throughout the entire confrontation, Bryan had the right to defend himself. Just because he chose not to, except at the end, doesn't mean he gave up that right. If the genders had been reversed, there is no doubt the shooter would have been exonerated. Despite my belief that Bryan was not guilty, there are moral considerations here. Bryan should have simply left the situation. There is the sense that Bryan killed Chandra because he thought he could get away with it. He knew her attack had been video recorded. This makes his maneuver seem planned and manipulative. As far as the plea deal, should Bryan have taken the offer, or should he have taken his chances at trial? I think the problem for Bryan was he was charged with first-degree murder. This charge was not justified based on the circumstances, but it was the charge he was facing. He had to look at the situation realistically. If he had been charged with something like manslaughter, then taking it to trial would have been the best decision. But with first-degree murder, he was facing life in prison. Even though he was not guilty in reality, a jury could have found him guilty. This is always a risk with a trial. I don't think that Bryan had much of a choice but to take the plea deal. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Chandra Lawson was self-centered, angry, aggressive, violent, threatening, unreasonable, hedonistic, impulsive, irresponsible, cold, callous, and had a sense of entitlement. Her entire life revolved around substance use. Nothing else mattered to her. Chandra felt as though she had the right to threaten and physically strike her husband, Bryan. She was aware that he had the right to defend himself, but believed he never would. In her mind, Chandra had completely dominated Bryan. This brought her great satisfaction. For his part, Bryan wanted things to work out with Chandra. He said that she was his queen, who he put on a pedestal. Despite this, repeated mistreatment made Bryan upset at Chandra. He simply ran out of patience. On the day of her death, Chandra decided to attack Bryan, and Bryan ended the confrontation. Due to the circumstances suggesting the shooting could have been planned, Bryan was charged with first-degree murder and had to take a plea deal. Now moving to my final thoughts. When a person becomes heavily invested in substance use, everything in their life revolves around it. Sometimes they can put on a good show, like this isn't true. They can pretend they care about other people, or they have big plans in their life, but the drugs are always number one. All too often, substance users with a severe pattern of use drag other people into their misery. That's what happened in the case of Chandra Lawson. Her poor choices resulted in her violent and sudden demise, but that was not the end of her ability to cause pain and suffering. Her legacy persisted in the form of her victim being convicted and imprisoned in connection with her death. Her mission was to cause as much pain as possible in obtaining pleasure for herself, and she was successful. Those are my thoughts in the case of Bryan Steven Lawson. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.